Okay, welcome back, everybody, to season 3 of the All Nation Church podcast. This season is called We Could Be Heroes. And today I'm joined by my co-host and good friend, James Aubrey.
Hello.
And we're also very, very excited because we're joined by somebody who's already been on the podcast before, our good friend Emma Scott.
Yes, hi.
Hey, welcome back.
It's not Christmas this time.
It's not, but there is cake.
There is cake.
So it sort of feels like Christmas.
Yeah, sorry, listeners, we didn't save any for you, but we're enjoying it.
Bake your own cake.
Yeah. Bake your own cake and listen to this episode. It's going to be a good episode. So, Emma, today we've got you on because we're going to be talking about one of your heroes in the faith, a lady called Amy Carmichael.
Yes.
And we're excited to kind of dive into the reasons why, some of the inspirations, some of the things perhaps you've learned from her life and from what God called her to do. But before we start firing questions your way, I'm going to send one James's way and ask James, could you kind of give us a little bit of an overview of Amy Carmichael?
Yeah, I've been given some important facts and figures about Amy Carmichael, so we all know who we're talking about. Amy Carmichael was born in Mill Isle on the north coast of Ireland on the 18th of December 1867, so she was a Victorian. She was the oldest of 7 children. She left Ireland at the age of 12 to go to boarding school in Yorkshire. When she was 18, her father died, which was a big event in her life. And when she was 22 years old, back in Belfast, so around about 1888, 1889, she heard the missionary to China, Hudson Taylor, speak, which had a really big influence on her. From there, then, she went off to serve as a missionary, first of all in Manchester, England.
Yeah.
Then she went to Japan in 1893. She moved to Sri Lanka and spent a little bit of time there before returning to England and then finally setting sail for India in November 1895. And that was where she spent the rest of her life. She died in January of 1951. And she worked as a missionary in India all that time. But I'm not going to give away what she did while she was there because that's going to be a lot, I think, of what Emma's going to talk to us about.
Okay, thanks, James. That was really helpful, just to paint a little bit of a picture about who she was. But Emma, I wonder if you could kind of dive right in and tell us, how did you come across Amy Carmichael's story?
Because she worked a lot with children, she's often in sort of those kids' books about heroes of the faith for kids, or there's this super old school series, I don't know if you've ever read any of them, called Trailblazers. Do you ever have Trailblazers books? Anyway, she was in one of the Trailblazers books. Yeah. And she was one of the few women in those books.
Right.
And look, I'm always on the lookout for a hero that is a female. Because I think like little girls need to be able to see those as well.
Yeah.
So I came across her that way. And so she did stuff as a young person.
Yeah.
As well as working with young people. And so I kind of thought, oh, this is a bit interesting. And then I was listening to a podcast called Women Worth Knowing, I want to say 2 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're allowed to cite other podcasts, but it's
You've
a really good
You've done it.
podcast.
Yeah.
It's a really good podcast.
We'll make sure Dave Patterson puts it in the show notes.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Dave. It's a really good podcast if you are interested in, other women who are heroes of faith, both ones who are alive today and ones who've passed on. But so I heard about her in there, and then I got another series of books, again, for the kids here, and she was in it again, and I thought, this lady keeps coming up. And every time I read about her, I'm reading a slightly different aspect, and I couldn't quite get a handle on what she did and stuff. So anyway, I went and looked her up, and it turns out she's written like 1 billion things herself.
Yeah.
So I looked into her a bit that way, and then she just keeps appearing on all this stuff. So every time I spot anything with Amy Carmichael, give it a little listen or a little read.
Yeah. And of course you mentioned about the stuff you do here. You and obviously Pete, your husband, are involved. You run all the kids ministry here.
Yes, sorry. Yes.
Well, no, it's my fault. I should have said that. So obviously that's something that's very significant to her life, isn't it?
Yeah. So she, I don't think she initially would have said, I am going out to work with children.
Yeah.
But every place where she was, so all the places that James just mentioned, when she was in Ireland, when she was in Manchester, when she was over in Sri Lanka, when she was in Japan and India, everywhere she went, she ended up with like this little group of children around her. Even when she went to convalesce, when she had left one of her mission trips and come back, actually the place where she was meant to be resting, she ended up with this group of kids from the local neighbourhood that she went, oh, well, let's just start a Bible study here. This just seemed to be like the pattern of her life, that every time she went to go do a work, she ended up with this little group of children who she would then start a Bible study for.
Yeah.
And it almost became her mission rather than her going out there to have that as her mission field.
Okay, yeah. It was almost as if it was something that through the course of her saying yes to God, God just kept steering her more and more, or focusing her more and more specifically on kids as well.
So there is the one instance when she was quite newly out in India, and she was wanting to work actually with adult women. And she was talking to this woman, and this woman, the way she describes it in her book was this woman was hard-hearted and hard-faced. Yeah. And she went away from this conversation, and she was, she wasn't scared of having hard conversations, but she came away from it and it had really affected her. Yeah. This woman's reaction to her, and particularly the woman's reaction to the gospel message. And God said to her, I want you to work with children so that they don't get hardened like this lady.
Wow.
So that rather than going, I'm going to talk to adults and I'm going to change their hearts, I want you to start talking to people before they come this way. Right. Because we don't have to live like this. We don't have to grow up hardened and then get softened later. We can grow up knowing Jesus. We can grow up with soft hearts.
Yeah.
So it was kind of from then that she was like, right, okay, this is actually a real word from God over my life about children specifically.
Yeah.
But that was quite, she'd done a lot of things before then with kids.
Yeah.
And actually it was then that she had a message saying, you need to put your focus here.
Yeah. And I think it's quite interesting that she obviously had quite a significant encounter with the Lord as a child as well, didn't she? Mm-hmm. So I think it was, she's 10 or 11.
Yeah.
And she had, she really heard the voice of God speaking to her. And that was significant for her for the rest of her life then, wasn't it?
Yes.
So I wonder if there's something in that as well.
There's quite a few times through her life, but particularly, when she was younger, where she heard the audible voice of God, and she did a bit of a Samuel, she turned around and looked for who it was, and then went, oh, this is God. And she had a few moments in her life that she really heard God. And interestingly, nearly all of them were about practically helping someone, or it was in a moment where she was giving practical help to someone that she had that, rather than being in a quiet moment of prayer. It was in the practicality that God then actually spoke to her about prayer or about time away and stuff.
Yeah.
So again, I think for Amy, this was a real defining point of hers, that that prayer life and the practical help really came hand in hand all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she took God's word very, very seriously, didn't she? And both in terms of his written word and his spoken word, which later on in her life led her to, for some people, they found her very driven. Other people found her, they wanted her to compromise a little bit, but she wouldn't, because she was so completely taken with, this is what God has said, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is what God said, this is what we're going to do. She was incredibly devoted, wasn't she?
Yeah, and she... Yeah. I mean, I think you see particularly in her later life, when she was already running a big nursery and stuff, she had very little patience for people who were willing to compromise. So particularly when it came to things like practical need, there's a point where she needs money, and she needs people to come in and help. She needs doctors. She needs nursery maids and things. And people are saying, well, there's all these people in the local community. Why don't you have them? And her rule was no. If you are not a Christian, you can't come and help here.
That's right.
And we won't take your money.
Yeah.
And people were saying, well, does it really matter? Does it really matter? But she really felt like God had told her this was the way to do it. And so she was sticking by that. And actually, it all really worked out, and God brought the right money and he brought the right people. Yeah. But she was willing to do things the hard way, if you like, in order to do it the right way.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's an incredible lesson to be learned from her life, isn't it? Because, she lived for a long time, living by the word of God, in faith to say, do you know what? God has said this, therefore I know that I don't need to compromise because God's going to back himself. He's going to provide for what he's calling me to do.
Yeah.
And that's a big thing for us even now to say, okay, maybe we're not going to be, running orphanages in India, but whatever it is that God has given us to do, to say, do you know what, God, not only do I know that you have told me to do it, but I know that you are going to provide, you've got everything I need to do it as well. And I can rely on you. I don't need to, quote, cut corners or find my own way to do it, to prove something,
Yeah, absolutely. And she was willing to take time to weigh that word as well.
Yeah.
So that first time when God spoke to her, I'm sure it said in her thing that she went away and she prayed about it for 2 days. And, at that sort of age, at 11, 12, to go, I'm gonna go home. And she literally went upstairs to her room and prayed for 2 days. What is God wanting to say to me? And then when she had come to that realization of about what that was that God was wanting to say, she then could come downstairs and do something with it. But she wasn't going to go, oh, well, it's, it's probably this. Maybe it's this. And that's, I think, the reason why she could have that confidence.
Yeah.
Same as when scripture came to her, she really went away and went, where is this? What does this mean? And what does this mean to me? Yeah. I think, a big thing for her life is she was able to go out and do these massive things because she spent that time in quiet time with God. She spent that time reading her Bible.
Yeah. And she's not only very devoted to prayer and devoted to God's word, but she was very devoted to kind of outworking the principles that she felt that she'd received firsthand from the Lord. I was quite struck reading one of her stories about the lesson she felt God taught her about money. And there were 3 scriptures that she really believed God had given her. The first one was from Haggai, where God says, the silver and gold is mine. The second one is where Jesus says, ask and you'll receive. And the third one is where Paul says, my God shall supply all your need. And as a result of that, she wrote this. She said, is the work for which we want the money God's chosen work for us, or our chosen work for him? If the former, will not he see after the money necessary? If the latter, then how can we expect anything better than we have? Can we expect a blessing to follow money given grudgingly? Should we not see that our root is right before expecting flowers and fruit? And the biographer that wrote these down, she said, these principles, discovered when Amy was alone with her Bible and her God, written down only for the small circle of readers, were never laid aside. Years later, their influence was felt by thousands. And I do love that about her, that she gets hold of God. She gets hold of God very young. She gets hold of God and really takes seriously what he says, and it never really leaves her. It's amazing.
I think, that bit where it says about making sure the root is right. Yeah. I think that really sums up a lot of how she lived and worked.
Totally.
She was all in for making sure that was right before she was going out. She didn't say, oh, there's this need for a church in Manchester, or there's this need for a nursery in India. She just did what God was telling her to do in that minute, and really did that well, and really made sure that God was with her in that, and then said, and what do you want next? And things that grew out of that were amazing, but that's not what she was seeking first.
Yeah. And Emma, we've in preparation for this talked a couple of times and joked about what of her life do we talk about? Because lots of people that we're talking about on this season have these moments where it seems to define the call of God on their life, or thrust them into maybe a public sphere in what God's done. All incredible. But of course, you don't necessarily have that for Amy's life. And I think there's even that in what we're talking about, which is this incredible faithfulness and consistency that she demonstrated throughout her whole life and wherever she went. Now, of course, one thing that perhaps we could say then she gave most of her life to was her time in India, which, again, we've talked and said it wasn't necessarily what she was expecting. She had all these other plans. She wanted to be in China, then she felt Japan, and she was there for maybe just over a year or so, I don't know. But could you tell us maybe a little bit about, because I think a lot of it does find its culmination in her time in India. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about what it was she was actually doing out there? We've alluded to it a bit, but what did it look like for her while she was out there?
Okay, so when she was first going out to India, she went out as an evangelist. I think that, this is a big passion there, is going out and that street evangelism, going out, talking to people, gospel message. She says that there should be no compromise amongst Christians, that while there is someone near you who doesn't yet know Jesus as their Lord and Saviour, it's your job to go out and talk to them. It's your job to go out and reach them. If they're in your sphere, if they're in your locality, that's your job.
Yeah,
and she had this huge thing that there was all these places in India where people didn't have the option of giving their life to Jesus because they'd never heard his name. They didn't know anything about him. So this was a big thing for her, and this was what she went out to go do.
Yeah.
And she was with a group called the Starry Cluster, who were travelling around, and they were talking to all these different people about Jesus, and they were seeing amazing things. So I'm just going to sidebar. So there was this one time that she went out to this little village, and they had a very, very small group of Christians, which was fairly rare for places that she was going to, that there was already like an established church. There was a group of, I think it was 8 Christians there. And in the week before she went, she was praying, and she felt like God told her that at this meeting, one new person would give their life to Jesus.
Right, yeah.
So she shared that with the group. She went, and at the end of the meeting, someone gave their life to Jesus.
Yeah.
She was due to come back again, and before she went back again, she got the word from God that 2 people would give their life to Jesus. So she went and she taught, and a man came up and he gave his life to Jesus and got baptized. And she said, well, I'm waiting for the 2 because I've been told there'll be 2. And he said, oh, well, my wife heard about what you were saying. She really wants to give her life to Jesus, but she's not here. She's away. And Amy said, well, that's fine. I've been told that before I return, that this other person, that like there will be 2 people.
Yeah.
So anyway, the next morning, she comes downstairs, and this man's there, and my wife is here. She really wants you to lead her to Jesus now. So there's the 2. The next time she gets a word that there's going to be 4. And she shares this with the church. Now, bearing in mind, they've already seen the 1 that she told them about. They've seen the 2 that she told them about. She said, there's going to be 4. And they said, well, there's not, because that's ridiculous. There's only 8 to start with. There's not going to be 4.
Yeah.
Obviously there is, because when God says it's going to happen, obviously it happens.
Yeah.
So within 3 meetings, the population of Christians in that village has doubled.
Wow.
And suddenly they're an established church and they're thriving. And this is what she really wanted to go out to India to do.
Yeah.
But while she was there, she had an encounter with someone who was working, she was like a servant of the temple.
Yeah.
So there was a practice at the time, which obviously then got outlawed, of having servants of the gods in the Hindu temples out there. And they were effectively temple prostitutes.
Yeah.
So they were used in different ceremonies, but also they were hired out by the temple priests to be used as prostitutes. And she came across some of the women there, and they told her about what was happening. And she tried to talk to some of them, and some of them ended up trying to run away. But actually, it was really hard to do that. And one of the big practices was that if you were a poor family and if you had a daughter, that you would give the baby to the temple.
Right.
Partly to get favour from the gods. And so she knew about this practice, but it was really hard to get any access to talk to these children. And then there was a young girl called Preena, who, when she was 5, had tried to run away from the temple. And then when she was 7, she got told about this lady called the child-stealing Amma, which is what the locals had named Amy. And she heard about this, and she got told about this in order to scare her away from Amy. But actually she went, this person could save me here.
She could steal me away.
Yeah, she could steal me away. So she managed to escape from the temple at night, and she walked like miles and miles and miles, like hours and hours at night to go and find Amy. She arrived in the middle of the night, didn't know where she was going because didn't actually know who Amy was, didn't actually know anything. So she sat outside a church building in the dark, and then a lady from the church came and found her and said, what are you doing here? And she said, I want to go, I need to see the child-stealing Amma.
Yeah.
They worked out that this must be Amy, but they said she's not here. She's off on a mission trip. She's off talking to other people. And this girl basically insisted that she would not leave. So all night she was talking to this lady from the church saying, well, I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving. This like little 7-year-old girl who's full of ferocity. I'm not leaving until I see the child stealing Amma. The next morning, in order to basically placate this child, they take her to the house where Amy should have been, but they were saying she was away. And as they get there, Amy had actually arrived that morning, has just sat on the veranda, and they see each other. And this kid runs up to Amy, sits in her lap, and basically won't leave her now. Yeah. And Amy describes it as this little kid suddenly being the purpose why she was there. Yeah. It's not something she sought. It's not what she was after. It's not what she knew she'd be doing. But in the arrival of this child, she just said it was like God was giving her this job to do. And then because of this one girl, there then ended up with more children. And she ended up with about 8 girls who she was in charge of and looking after. And she said that she didn't want to have her feet tied, which is how they described motherhood at the time in India, which I totally understand. This idea that when you're a parent, particularly a mum, at the time they were said it's like having your feet tied. You can't go anywhere now. This is your former life of being able to run around is done. Yeah. And your feet are tied by your children. And she always said she didn't want to have her feet tied.
Children tie the mother's feet is a Hindu phrase. Yeah.
Right.
So she didn't want this. And so she took the kids with her. So she's going off on all these mission trips, taking these 8 kids. Some of them are babies with her. They're like sleeping on the roadside, cooking their tea over open fires. Like, I find just bringing my 3 kids to the park stressful. She's taking these 8 children on mission.
On all their mission trips.
Yeah. Amazing. But one of the kids gets really quite ill. So they have to go back to the house in order for this girl to be cared for. And they're there for quite a long time. And while they're there, she looks around and she sees this is a lot simpler, and also some really good things are coming out of these kids being settled. So the older children had kind of taken Amy's lead and were doing Bible studies with the younger children. Yeah. Just cooking food for them all. They were all healthier. They were all thriving in this more settled environment. And she went away and prayed about it. And she really felt like God was asking her to move into the stage of being an Amma, which is like being a mother. Yeah. And get a place for these children. And it feels like as soon as she did that, everyone arrived with their kids. And she very quickly ended up with, I want to say 70 girls. Yeah. Like in quite a short space of time, 8 to 70. And then that's what she was doing. She was running this orphanage, this home where I've got a little mission statement.
Oh, yeah.
So this is what she said the point of it was. The purpose is to save children in moral danger, to train them to serve others, to support the desolate and the suffering, to do anything that may be shown to be the will of our Heavenly Father in order to make his love known, especially to the people of India. So there was this real importance to her that she wasn't just caring for kids who are orphans, or just treating the needy, that it was about them being in moral danger and training them to serve others as well. Yeah. Like she really took it seriously, that she wasn't just looking after kids. She was discipling them alongside caring for them. Yeah. But yeah, I think for someone who went out to be a street evangelist, to then, in her words, cutting 1,000 toenails, it's like quite a jump.
Yeah, she made huge sacrifices, didn't she? I mean, she never married.
No.
I don't think she ever went back to England after she went to India in 1895. I think she spent more than 50 years of her life there without returning home. Yeah. She didn't take any holidays. She was very reluctant to take a furlough. She would only... They would all cart off to like a slightly more in climate, a better place for the climate for a couple of months occasionally, but she really just worked and worked and worked caring for these girls for over 50 years, didn't she?
Yeah. And I think that like really rubbed off on all the people around her. You know,
definitely did.
When you see the people who came to work with her in Dohnavur, they all seem to take on this work ethic. And like I say, like, I don't know, she didn't do well with people who would compromise on that work ethic. So a lot of the missionaries who she originally met when she went to India, she was quite scathing of them in her writing, the way they would still try and live on a British schedule, and they would still take a lot of afternoon tea, and they'd still have games of tennis, and she was quite unimpressed with the whole situation.
She was, and you talk about being British there. She was radical in the sense that she insisted on wearing Indian clothes. So she wore saris.
Yeah. So the clothes thing came from Japan, actually,
That's
not
true.
from
Yes,
India.
of course it did, yes.
So she was talking to a lady. Again, it comes back to the fact that all of the stuff is about how to best get the gospel message across.
Yes.
So she's talking to an older lady on the streets in Japan, and it was really cold. And she had Amy had a condition where she really struggled with the cold. But so she was over there, and so she had really thick woolen gloves on and a big scarf and all coats and everything. And she was talking to this lady, and this older lady was being quite receptive to the message about Jesus, and she's there with her translator, and it's all going really well. And then a couple of minutes into the conversation, Amy notices that this older lady is just staring at her hands all the time. And she keeps trying to talk, and then she notices this lady's attention is waning and waning and waning, and eventually through the translator this lady asks about the gloves and asks if Amy would take them off to show her like how they work and so that she could feel them. And from that moment on, the conversation never really gets back to Jesus, and Amy came away from it and just said, if my gloves are enough of a distraction to prevent someone from hearing the gospel message, then I don't want to wear them. And so she said, from then on, I don't want to dress any differently to the people around her. But she had to really work and get permission from a lot of people to make that happen, to be allowed to wear a kimono out in Japan, and then to be allowed to wear a sari in India. But it was a really important thing for her, because she said that we should live like, eat like, and look like the people that we're trying to reach.
Yeah. And I think you said something just now which I think it really summarizes her life, which was, it really was all about the gospel for her. And even as you described, you said earlier about God had really put something inside her about speaking to children and training, not just changing adults' hearts and minds, but effectively getting them before then.
Yeah.
Which of course then comes back up in what she was doing in India, which was not what she was expecting. But because her passion was to do what God asked her to do and to share the gospel, she laid herself down, and even her own personal passions for the way she expected the gospel to be outworked, she laid it down. And actually in doing so, she was seeing these children, their lives changed, and falling in love with Jesus. And I think at one point I read that she was taking them to a local church, and there were so many of them that the church pastor was like, eventually, you need to just start your own church, because I don't have enough space for you all. But even in her being, that mother figure to them, she was living the gospel for them, wasn't she? And they were then seeing the way she was living towards Jesus, and then starting to replicate that in their own lives.
Yeah, and she went from being someone who the local community would keep their children far from, because there's this awful lady who's coming in here and really messing things up for the caste system, and to being someone who they went, there's something about this lady and about this place that these poorer families, where they could have still taken their daughters to the temple like everyone around them were doing, were going, I want my daughter to be here instead, which is a massive thing. And I think nowadays we can look at it with, these eyes of going, oh, how awful that these parents are good. But actually, they were doing a really huge thing by giving their children to Amy to be raised as Christian, because everyone knew that's what she was doing. Everyone knew if you come here, you will be hearing the gospel, you will be in daily Bible studies, you will be in church services, as opposed to going to the Hindu temple, where the belief was that then you would get some kind of favor with the Hindu gods and stuff. So there was, in really showing that love and care of Jesus, she actually was affecting this whole huge community. And even though she was an amazing street evangelist and lots of people came to know Jesus, I'm talking just now about the ones and the twos, actually with this nurturing with the kids, you're seeing hundreds in really short spaces of time getting the message, but also getting baptized. And you read about it here that these kids are giving their lives to Jesus, and they really are giving their lives to Jesus.
Yeah.
They're living their whole lives in the good of that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, for me, when I read about her and when I hear a story, I just think there's something in going, just because everyone around you is delivering the gospel in this way, just because this is the way that it has been done and it's the way that you've been taught to do it. And even if you enjoy this, actually sometimes God has something different for you that is going to be so much bigger for his purpose.
Yeah.
There's also another part of her influence and ministry you've mentioned a couple of times, but it'd be great to hear a bit more about her writing. She was a prolific writer all the way through her life.
Yeah.
And then she suffers an injury in 1931 that she never really recovers from. She spends the last 20 years of her life bedbound, effectively.
Yeah.
But she's constantly writing letters, writing pamphlets, writing books. You've mentioned you've read some of her writings. How did they influence you, and how do they influence people more widely?
So she's written in a few different styles. So she writes, like, say, some letters. She wrote
lots of poetry as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of poetry. There's a letter that she wrote home originally. I think you mentioned, Kier, that the way things were, the way things are.
Yeah.
And this is when she's first writing home to Britain, to the people who've been financially supporting her, and also to just some wider Christian circles about the situation currently in India. And she doesn't pull any punches about what's going on. No. And she'll write about things like when she'll write about the times when she's been tricked. So things like when someone has looked like they're giving their life to Jesus, actually in order to get away from a situation so that they can then run away with their boyfriend instead.
Yes, I remember that story. Yeah.
Which was a really big moment for her because it was the first time that she'd had someone convert to Christianity and then actually go, oh, that wasn't real. It
wasn't genuine, yeah.
Yeah, and it was actually a girl who she was from a different caste to her boyfriend, and in order for them to run away together, she needed some way of getting away from her home and away from her father, and she used Amy to do that. And that had a massive impact on Amy. But Amy decided, and she says about then in her writings, that despite the disappointments and yes, even the betrayal, we will still continue sharing, and we will still continue to support people convert into Christian faith. But she also writes some devotionals for the children. So one of the ones that like always sticks with me a lot is she writes a book called If, which is she writes from when she was bedbound. So she used to lead the children in a devotional every morning and their staff at Donovan. And then after she can no longer leave her bed to go do that, she basically writes the devotional every day. So we now have like 20 years worth of daily devotionals. There's a book called If, which is very, very short. You only have to read a sentence a day. And it always starts of, if da-da-da-da, then I know nothing of Calvary love. And it's things like, if I can see wrong in someone and not bring it up, and brotherly love, then I know nothing of Calvary love. And it's all these huge statements that, like, I challenge people to read it and not have it go around their head for the rest of the day. Because it's just very simple thoughts about forgiveness, or about sharing the word with someone, or but they all start with if blah blah blah, then I know nothing of Calvary love. And just those, she breaks it down to really simple thoughts that like the kids could take away with them, the staff could take for the rest of their day, and then for us that we can still carry on, that then just really stick with you and affect how you then see the rest of your day. And she has that real gift of being able to sum things up in a nice little package that still packs quite a lot of punch.
Yeah. And it still continues today. Not just obviously her story is incredible, but also the truth that she's written as well then. It has a big impact on people today as well, doesn't it? So
interesting. Maybe it's because of the time she was writing, but when you look at a lot of her work, it's for an adult audience, I would say, but actually the truths of it can pretty much all be understood by children. Right, so like with her devotional and stuff, I don't think you'd have much of a challenge of then reading this, putting it in more modern language and letting your children understand it.
Yeah.
Which I think is something quite special.
Yeah. Yeah. So, kind of to bring it into land then, could you maybe say a few words about all you know of Amy Carmichael's life, all you've read? What has been, would you say, is perhaps a legacy that you found in your life from her, but also maybe that she's left in the world today? I know that's a big question, but
Yeah, I think probably partly what we were talking about earlier in terms of like laying down what you would like your calling to be for what God is actually calling you to now.
yeah,
That sometimes God asks you to do a great work and there is a shelf life on how long he's asking you to do that for before he
Yeah.
asks you to do a new thing.
yeah,
But also for me, I feel like in that aspect of caregiving being a ministry.
yeah.
So,
Wow.
like I say, like it just makes me laugh that the quote that she gave about that God has called her to show love through the cutting of 1,000 toenails.
Yeah.
Because it might have felt like by the time you've cut the toenails of over 100 children,
Yeah.
like that's all you've done for an hour.
Yeah.
But actually, you've done something massive for Jesus. It all comes back to that washing feet. All those
Yeah.
things that Jesus taught us how to do. And
Yeah.
she's doing them in changing nappies, in feeding people, in, early on when she first heard God talking, when she helped this older lady carry her load, physically carry her things, that actually that showing love is one of the easiest ways to impact people with the gospel that you
Yeah.
can have, easier than showing flashcards or
Yeah.
being very clever with your words, just physically showing Jesus's love.
Yeah.
And then not being afraid to immediately follow it up with telling people the good news.
Yeah.
I think
Really good.
Amy inspires me a lot with going, you can't just do the one. You can't
Yeah.
just do the works
Yeah.
and hope that people will know because Jesus.
Yeah.
You have to say and Jesus
Yes.
and be ready for that rejection. But you
Yeah.
also can't just say Jesus loves you without being willing to say, and because he loves you, I am going to
Yeah.
XYZ.
Yes. Oh, that's a good lesson to learn, I think, for all of us, isn't it?
Yeah.
And even that, for those of you who are listening and for us sat here now, to remember that if you're doing something in the love of Christ, motivated by him, it could be as seemingly insignificant as cutting toenails. But if it's what God has given you to do and you're doing it faithfully, you're going to see fruit. in
Yeah.
it. You're going to see God show up in people's lives. And it's not about, oh, I'll just do this to get to the greater work or to get to the platform or whatever it might be. It's God has called me to do this and I'm doing it.
Yeah.
And like you said, I'm letting people know why I'm doing it as well. It's not motivated by my own personality or my own care. I'm doing this because God has sent me, because I'm moved with compassion, and it's his compassion, which I think is really special. I wondered if I could just finish. Actually, we talked about her writing, and in research for this, I actually came across a really lovely bit of a poem that she wrote, and I just think that particularly the last line is just, it really defines this relationship between the practicality but the passion with which she had that moved her to do that. So she wrote this. She said, "From silken self, O captain free, thy soldier who would follow thee, from subtle love of softening things, from easy choices weakenings, let me not sink to be a clod, make me thy fuel, O flame of God." I just think that's such a beautiful prayer that she's prayed. Always, God, make me your fuel. Make me the one that you've set on fire to do your great works. And those great works, as is evident in her life, is expressed in the small practical details and big bold decisions she made, even to leave her home country. And so we hope that you've been blessed by this episode. We hope that you've been inspired in hearing Emma talk about Amy Carmichael. We'll make sure that we've got some links to some of her writings and books in the show notes. Thank you, Dave Patson. And we will be back again for another episode of season 3 of the All Nation Church podcast. But for now, let's just say thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you,
for
Emma,
being with us.
You're so welcome.
We're glad to have you. And thank you, James.
Pleasure.
We will see you on the next episode. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.